Imagine standing firm against just an overwhelming tide, a force so immense it threatens to sweep away your entire way of life, your history, your identity.
Yeah.
What do you do? How do you fight back when the odds are just stacked against you? That powerful image of defiance is, well, that's exactly where we're starting our deep dive today. Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is crafted just for you as a student in Mr. A's World History class. We're about to take a closer look at L8, Resistance to Imperialism, from your Unit 4. Imperialism, our mission. It's to unpack the diverse, often really ingenious methods people use to resist these huge global forces of imperialism.
Yeah, and they really were diverse.
And as we explore these fascinating stories, we'll keep our central historical question right up front. Considering the diverse methods people employed to resist imperialism, what criteria are most essential for evaluating the effectiveness of these strategies?
That's the core, isn't it?
Absolutely. Imperialism was this massive disruptive force across the globe. It fundamentally altered lives, cultures. But with that immense pressure, people found incredibly varied ways to push back.
And that's so critical to remember. These weren't simple, monolithic struggles. The responses were as varied and complex as the societies themselves. So as we delve into these different approaches, I'd really encourage you, the listener, to think about your own initial assumptions. Which of these strategies might you guess would be the most effective in the long run?
Good question.
And which might seem maybe the least effective? Just holding on to those initial thoughts will help you evaluate the evidence we uncover, against that central question of effectiveness.
All right, so with that vivid picture in mind, how did people actually push back? Our sources give us a pretty clear framework, highlighting 4 distinct ways.
Okay.
First up, we have what's called military resistance. This is often what immediately springs to mind, right? Direct, often violent, confrontation.
The classic image.
Exactly. We're talking about targets of imperialism waging war, officially or unofficially. It was characterized by violence from both sides, and more often than not, the Western powers, with their superior weaponry, they tended to come out on top.
Yeah, that technological gap was huge.
It's a very direct form of resistance. There's no ambiguity there.
And then stepping away from the battlefield, we have intellectual resistance. What's fascinating here is how the fight shifts. It moves from physical confrontation to the realm of ideas and culture.
Ah, interesting.
So this involved people making, logical or emotional arguments against imperialist claims. But crucially, it also meant actively maintaining traditional culture and customs instead of just assimilating.
So holding on to who they are.
Precisely. This is definitely an indirect form of resistance, but, well, no less potent.
That's a crucial distinction, isn't it? The fight shifting from brute force to cultural and intellectual ground. It makes you wonder how that kind of resistance actually, secures independence eventually. Then there's adaptation. Okay, this is where things get really interesting. Targets of imperialism actually embraced the ways of the West.
Right, using their own tools against them in a way.
Sort of. They might adopt Western technology, military tactics, even political structures, not to surrender, but to strengthen their own military, and sometimes, incredibly, even create their own empires.
Wow.
Another indirect form of resistance, but yeah, a very different approach.
And finally, we encounter sabotage. This involved finding sneaky, often covert ways to undermine the power and profits of the colonizing powers.
Ah, the undercover stuff.
Exactly. Think of it as a quiet, persistent chipping away at the foundation. And yes, this too falls into the category of indirect resistance.
Okay, so we have these 4 very different pathways. Direct military fight, the battle of ideas and culture, strategically embracing some of the colonizers' ways, and then these subtle, often hidden acts of sabotage.
Exactly. And as you listen to the case studies we're about to discuss, constantly challenge your initial predictions. Each example might offer some surprising nuances that force you to redefine what effective truly means in the context of resisting such an overwhelming force.
Okay, let's dive into our first major case study, military resistance. And for this, we're looking at the, frankly, remarkable story of Ethiopia.
Ah, yes, Adwa.
This truly stands out. During the scramble for Africa, almost every single African nation fell to a European power. But there was one colossal exception. Ethiopia, also known as Abyssinia.
And a long history there.
And this wasn't some new small state. The Ethiopian Empire had existed for a staggering 6th century, 600 years.
Indeed. The critical moment really came in 1889 when Italy signed a treaty with Ethiopia. But here's the kicker.
Yeah.
The Italian version of this treaty essentially claimed Ethiopia as a colonial protectorate. But Ethiopia, they completely refuted that interpretation, insisting on their full sovereignty.
They weren't having it.
Not at all. So when Italy was eventually forced to sue for peace after a decisive defeat for them at Adwa, Ethiopia's demand was clear and firm. Recognize our absolute independence. And they got it.
What's fascinating here is why Ethiopia was so successful against a European power like Italy. Our sources tell us Italy was largely unprepared for a remote war against a well-organized state.
Right. Logistics are key.
And they completely underestimated Ethiopia, mistakenly considering them primitive. That arrogance, it was a critical misstep, wouldn't you say?
It absolutely was. Underestimating your opponent, especially one with 600 years of history as an organized state, I mean, that's always a recipe for disaster.
True.
We even have this amazing painting, The Battle of Adwa, by an unknown Ethiopian artist. Now, while we can draw specific conclusions about, say, the battle's tactical details just from the painting itself.
Right, it's art, not a battle plan.
Exactly. But it vividly captures the intensity and scale of the conflict. It offers a powerful visual insight into the fierce resistance and, frankly, the sheer number of Ethiopian fighters involved.
So the sources highlight the PROS and CONS of military resistance. The main PRO is pretty straightforward. It may be relatively quick. You engage, you win, independence is secured like Ethiopia did.
Maybe quick.
But that's a massive maybe. The CONS are incredibly significant.
Yeah.
Human casualties and immense costs. How do we even weigh those?
Well, that's precisely the central question, isn't it? Ethiopia stands out because they managed to mitigate those costs somehow for a truly decisive win. But for most, military resistance was just a brutal calculation of loss, often leading to defeat because of that European technological superiority.
Right.
So this success, Ethiopia's success against that general trend of European triumph, it forces us to consider that while military resistance is high risk, high reward, the conditions for its success, like Ethiopia's strong internal organization and the colonizers' underestimation, are actually quite specific.
So context matters.
A lot. Immensely. It certainly reshapes one's initial evaluation of its overall effectiveness. It's not always the losing strategy people assume.
Okay, from the sheer defiance of military might, let's shift our focus. We're moving to a different kind of battlefield. The mind. Our next powerful example of intellectual resistance takes us to Ghana, which eventually won its independence in 1957.
A key date.
The Ghanaians used a combination of strategies, including boycotts of British goods, organized protests, and even some sabotage. But one interesting detail from our sources is that resistance was often directed not just at the British, but also at Ghanaian chiefs. Why was that?
Yeah, that's a very important point about the nature of indirect rule. The colonial rulers, in this case the British, often governed through appointed local chiefs or princes rather than setting up a whole new colonial administration everywhere.
Yeah.
And this indirect rule was a clever, sometimes pretty insidious tactic by the colonizers. By governing through existing local structures, they basically made the colonized administrators responsible for unpopular policies like taxes or forced labor.
So they deflect the anger.
Exactly. It deflected direct anger from the colonial power and, tragically, could even create internal divisions within the community, making these local figures the visible targets of the people's frustration.
Right, that makes sense. So the first significant movement after World War II was led by a group of professionals, lawyers, and merchants. This group became known as the United Gold Coast Convention, or UGCC.
The UGCC, yes.
A political organization formed by these educated professionals. It effectively created a formal vehicle for their growing anti-colonial feelings. They organized a widespread boycott of British goods between 47 and 48, and also a servicemen's march in 1948.
And this march is significant. What happened when those servicemen who had actually fought for the British in the war marched peacefully to demand their rights?
It didn't end well, did it?
No. The government, shockingly, responded by opening fire on them in 1948. They killed 3 people.
3 people killed for marching peacefully. That, of course, just fueled more resistance, I imagine.
Absolutely. Out of this tragedy grew something called the Positive Action Campaign, which was a form of nonviolence, non-cooperation.
Like Gandhi.
In some ways, yes. People chose to strike by not shopping or doing business, really hitting the colonizers where it hurt their profits and economic stability. It was an intellectual argument turned into mass action.
Okay, so looking at the PROS, a CONS of intellectual resistance, the PRO is that it's likely less violent than direct military confrontation. Seems obvious.
Generally, yes.
However, as we just saw at the Servicemen's March, the CONS are clear. It's not completely without risk. People can still get hurt or killed.
Mm-hmm.
And it may take a long time to organize and change minds. This isn't quick like a battle potentially could be.
Exactly. Which raises an important question for you, the listener, to consider. Now that you've seen both military resistance in Ethiopia and intellectual resistance in Ghana, has your evaluation of which strategy might be most effective changed?
Yeah, how do they stack up?
How do these two compare and contrast in terms of their effectiveness criteria? What does victory even mean in these different contexts? Is just political independence or something more?
Lots to think about there. All right, let's turn our attention now to adaptation, and for this, we're going to Japan.
Japan, a fascinating case.
Our source provides some really interesting observations from Kinoshita, who was a daimyo, a feudal lord of Hakon, Japan. He made these observations back in 1853, very soon after American warships, led by Commodore Perry, appeared outside Tokyo, basically just showing up and flexing their naval muscle.
A shock to the system.
Definitely. And Tinausuke's suggestion was incredibly strategic. He proposed that the Japanese must construct new steamships, especially powerful warships, and then load them with goods not needed in Japan.
Okay, why the goods?
Well, his plan was to employ Dutchmen as masters and mariners for a time, but critically, they would put Japanese of ability and integrity on board with them to study the use of large guns, the handling of ships, and the rules of navigation.
Learn from the inside.
Exactly. So in this scenario, is Japan taking control of its own destiny? Sure sounds like it, doesn't it? Because the goal is self-mastery of these powerful Western techniques, not just, blind imitation.
Exactly. The genius of this plan, as C. Nasik saw it, was its secret purpose. These would openly be called merchant vessels, but they would, in fact, have the secret purpose of training a navy.
Sneaky.
Very. His ultimate goal was for Japanese people to sail the oceans freely and gain direct knowledge of conditions abroad without relying on others. He firmly believed that the clever and quick-witted Japanese would not prove inferior to Westerners if we begin training at once.
Wow.
And the real genius of Japan's adaptation isn't just their cleverness, it's how they recognized that true strength wasn't about resisting all change, but strategically absorbing it on their own terms, turning the colonizers' tools into instruments of their own self-preservation and, well, even expansion later on.
It completely flips the script on what resistance can look like, doesn't it?
It really does.
Yeah. So for adaptation, the PROS seemed clear. Gaining technological and military strength and the potential for self-sufficiency in the long run. Big advantages.
Definitely long-term thinking.
But there are definite cons, too. It involves reliance on colonizing powers initially, which must have been a really difficult pill to swallow for many.
A necessary evil, perhaps, in their view.
It's also a lengthy process. This doesn't happen overnight. And there's a potential loss of traditional or cultural practices as you embrace foreign ways. Expert, how do we evaluate that trade-off? Is losing some cultural practices worth long-term independence?
That's the incredibly complex ethical and strategic dilemma right at the heart of adaptation. It shows that even strategies that seem beneficial on the surface come with their own set of profound trade-offs.
Yeah.
For Japan, that calculation seemed to pay off in the long run, leading to modernization and eventually their own imperial ambitions. But it certainly highlights the difficult choices faced by colonized peoples.
Difficult is an understatement. Okay, our final type of resistance is sabotage. This is often less visible in the historical record, maybe harder to track, but no less impactful. And we see incredible examples of it in places like French Indochina and the Dutch East Indies.
Yeah, sabotage really highlights the ingenuity and, frankly, the subtle power of people facing overwhelming force. Take, for example, what our sources call the anti-imperialist vegetable.
But what now?
The anti-imperialist vegetable. Crops like corn and especially cassava allowed indigenous people to migrate and change their farming patterns to evade colonial oppression and forced labor.
How did that work?
Well, cassava in particular required very little labor for a big return of high-calorie tubers. This enabled mobile groups to feed themselves while resisting the colonizers' attempts to tie them to fixed lands and, force them into labor systems.
So they could just pick up and leave and still eat?
Essentially, yes. The colonizers, in their frustration, actually branded these as lazy crops because they couldn't control their production easily.
That's brilliant. They literally ate their way to freedom, or at least autonomy.
In a way, yeah. And then there's the fascinating, almost comical story of the Hanoi rat problem.
Oh, I think I've heard about this one.
French construction projects brought a massive rat infestation to Hanoi. So the French, in their infinite wisdom, decided to pay locals for rat tails as proof of extermination.
Okay, seems logical. Ish.
But what happened? People started clipping the tails of live rats and releasing them back into the sewers.
No, seriously.
Seriously, this caused the rat population to grow even larger, and it completely broke the colony's treasury that was paying out for these tails. It was a hilarious, subversive move that totally undermined their control.
Wow, that's genius in a really unexpected way.
Yeah.
Okay, here's another incredibly surprising example. French education backfiring.
Ah, yes, the unintended consequences.
The French intended their education system to assimilate indigenous peoples, right? To make them embrace French values and culture. And, okay, to some extent it worked. But it also, ironically, gave these indigenous peoples intellectual tools to resist French imperialism. It led to the formation of networks, the sharing of new ideas about revolution.
Think of figures like Nguyen Thai Hoc, who founded the Vietnamese Nationalist Party, and Von Nguyen Giap, the general who eventually led the Vietnamese against the French. Both were products of French education.
They literally turned the colonizers' own tool against them.
It's a classic example. And then there's the seemingly minor act of stealing a curtain in the Dutch East Indies.
Stealing a curtain. How is that resistance?
Well, Raden Mas Adipati Brotadiningrat, an aristocrat, he snatched a curtain that was used to symbolize separation between colonizer and colonized during formal ceremonies. This wasn't just petty theft, it was a politically charged symbolic act. It signaled disrespect for Dutch authority.
Ah, okay. Symbolism.
Exactly. And this seemingly small crime led to a very public court battle that inspired a fundamental questioning of colonialism's morality among aristocrats and others. It was like a tiny stone that created these big ripples.
Our sources detail even more subtle forms of sabotage, too. Like in the Dutch East Indies, peasants moved between Javanese and Dutch-ruled areas to avoid forced labor and taxes.
Playing the system.
Yeah. And they resisted regulations by inaccurately reporting land or crop yields, making colonial administration just a nightmare.
Constant frustration for the officials.
And in the Southeast Asian highlands, people moved around constantly to avoid taxation and forced labor, actively resisting colonial censuses and record-keeping, sometimes even vandalizing offices to destroy records.
Making themselves invisible to the state.
Right. And get this. When the British tried to imitate local community gatherings like feasts to gain favor and control, the locals simply didn't show up. They opted instead to hold smaller, private gatherings that excluded the colonizers.
A social boycott. Powerful stuff. As the author George Orwell famously noted in Burma, there were countless acts of this kind of creative resistance. Anonymous acts like spitting at or tripping British colonizers, or laughing and insulting them from a distance so they couldn't be identified. Colonized people also created secret channels, using special language codes, inside jokes, or satire to share their feelings of dissent.
Wow.
What's truly insightful about sabotage is how it proves that power isn't just about military might. It's also about systems, resources, even morale. By chipping away at these seemingly minor points, the colonized could inflict disproportionate damage and maintain their dignity, even without overt confrontation.
But it's hard to see in history books.
Exactly. Sabotage, by its very nature, is often more difficult to see in the historical record because it was, by design, off the record. Historians have to dig much deeper, reading between the lines, to uncover these hidden forms of resistance.
Okay, so for sabotage, the PROS are that it can be less risky, personally, and more people might be able to participate because it doesn't always require direct confrontation or massive organization. It empowers individuals and small groups.
Democratizes resistance in a way.
But the con is pretty significant. It isn't quick. It's a slow burn, chipping away over time rather than providing an immediate decisive victory.
Definitely a long game strategy.
All right. Now that we've explored military resistance, intellectual resistance, adaptation, and sabotage, let's bring it back home. Back to our central historical question for your Mr. A's class. Considering the diverse methods people employed to resist imperialism, what criteria are most essential for evaluating the effectiveness of these strategies?
Yeah, after looking at all this, what does effective mean? We've seen a remarkable range of strategies today, from, the overt military confrontation of Ethiopia to the intellectual and adaptive tactics of Ghana and Japan, and even these ingenious, often hidden acts of sabotage we saw in Indochina and the Dutch East Indies.
A huge spectrum.
It really is. And I think what we've learned is that effectiveness isn't just about immediate victory or even outright political individual independence. It's also about maintaining dignity, preserving culture, and achieving long-term autonomy, sometimes through these incremental, subtle steps that might not even be recorded in the official history books.
So the definition of success itself is complex.
Very much so. So as you continue to think about these forms of resistance, maybe consider this. How do these varied approaches inform our understanding of power dynamics today? Especially when the powerful often look for obvious, large-scale challenges.
Yeah, the things they expect.
Right. While quieter, creative forms of resistance might be overlooked but are continuously chipping away at the status quo, what forms of hidden transcripts, those unwritten acts of defiance and subversion, might exist in our own world, challenging power in subtle ways that we might not immediately recognize?